All week long, we have, of course, been talking about the rise in domestic terror, this in the wake of the mass shootings in El Paso and Dayton that killed 31 people. FBI Director Christopher Wray says there have been about 100 domestic terror arrests in just the past 9 months, and many of them fit a similar profile.
A majority of the domestic terrorism cases that we've investigated are motivated by some version of what you might call white supremacist violence.
And on top of that, CNN is reporting that White House officials have stymied Homeland Security efforts to combat domestic terror, including white supremacy. Instead, the executive branch wanted to focus on jihadist terror groups instead. The White House, by the way, pushing back on that report. Joining me to discuss, former FBI agent, or special agent, I should say, Manny Gomez. He's also a former sergeant in the NYPD. Manny, before we get to the fight against white supremacy today, I want to start with a quick history lesson for people who say white supremacy is a hoax or that the federal government should focus elsewhere. The Justice Department's first task when it was formed in 1870 was to stamp out the Klan and other domestic terror groups as they tried to stop civil rights. I'm wondering, was the fight against white supremacy groups also a focus of the Justice Department when you worked for the department as an FBI agent?
Well, the focus has always been anti-civil rights and anti-civil amendments, whether it be the Klan or any other group. So this has always been a focus of the Department of Criminal Justice and obviously the FBI.
Manny, are white supremacists terrorists? It's easy to say that a white supremacist who goes on a mass shooting is a domestic terrorist, though people still disagree about using that language. But terrorism is about more than just violence. It's also about spreading fear. So I'm wondering, do you think white supremacists are terrorists?
Well, we're blessed in this country to have a First Amendment right of speech. One could say that they don't like Hispanics, such as myself. One could say that they don't like other ethnic groups. White supremacists obviously voice their opinion that they don't like other ethnic groups or religions, etc., and they have that First Amendment right to say so. The minute they cross the line and they become actively and or aggressively violent towards that point of view, that's when the Department of Justice, the FBI, and local law enforcement needs and should get involved.
We do know that some people who have gone on domestic terror rampages have done so under what they say is the following of Donald Trump. The Florida pipe bomber, the guy with the van covered in Trump propaganda who sent bombs to Democrats and to media figures. In his lawyer's sentencing statement at the end of his trial, he directly attributed the bombings to Donald Trump, said the bomber listened to Trump and believed him. Called Trump a surrogate father, and that following Trump's lead, he began to consider Democrats not just as dangerous in theory, but imminently and seriously dangerous to his personal safety, hence the pipe bombings. I'm curious, in your work in the FBI, is there a parallel in how terror groups tend to communicate themes and messages like that?
Of course. We know that hundreds of people throughout this country and throughout the world have been radicalized by Islamic fundamentalism, through ISIS, through Al-Qaeda, etc. Just the same way that people are radicalized by white supremacists. Human beings tend to gravitate towards certain groups. They want to feel that they belong to something, that they are part of something, and that they are part of a bigger cause. That being said, that doesn't mean that they could take the extra step and act aggressively, violently, or in some way hinder other people's rights as protected by our country's laws and constitution, etc.
Understood, as we're just sort of searching for parallels here so we can figure out how best to deal with it. Now, nobody's suggesting that the president told that guy to start sending pipe bombs or told the El Paso shooter to go to that Walmart. They both appear to have taken the president's messaging too literally. I'm wondering, are there parallel examples from terror groups where followers misread what leaders were saying?
Yeah, absolutely, and we've seen that in Islamic fundamentalism for a number of years, beginning with 9/11, where they were told hey, the Westerns are the infidels, they're evil, and you should go out and to pursue and actively kill them is a blessing, and you will be rewarded in the afterlife. We don't see the same parallel with white supremacy. We do see an administration that obviously actively pursues heated political rhetoric, but again, that should not incite anybody to the point where they're going to actively go out and create these mass massacres that we've seen in El Paso and certainly in Dayton, because that person had nothing to do with the Trump rhetoric, etc.
I want to shift over to something that Tucker Carlson said the other day. He was talking about white supremacy on the air, and first of all, he called it a hoax. I'm wondering how you'd respond to that.
Listen, there's been racism in this country for decades. The Ku Klux Klan still exists, and it's active, and it still holds marches, etc., and it's alive and well. That being said, they are protected by the First Amendment, just like other groups. Black Lives Matters, etc., they're protected by the First Amendment. So is there racism in this country? Yes. Is it something that is a problem? Only when it crosses the line. We have a situation in this country now that it's been brought to the, it's been brought up. It's been down in the bowels of political correctness now for decades. But yes, because of this administration and other things that are happening throughout the country, it has been brought up. But it has always been around. It's unfortunately something that we have to deal with, and we have to police it and aggressively put it down once it crosses the line of civil disobedience.
I want to go back to Tucker Carlson for a second, because he also said that that all the members of every white supremacist group in the U.S. wouldn't even fill a college football stadium. I'll point out that some college football stadiums can fit 110,000 people. That feels like a lot of white supremacists, but you know, the El Paso shooter wasn't a member of a group. He was just a white supremacist. Neither were a lot of other shooters. Does it matter how many people are parts of these groups, or just how influenced they are by the rhetoric?
It doesn't matter how large the group is. It just matters how they act. If they're acting for a cause, such as white supremacy or whatever other the cause is, Islamic fundamentalism, etc., and they're going out and causing a mass shooting, then they're wrong, and they need to be punished. But before that, they need to be identified, investigated, and hopefully neutralized before that mass shooting happens. And that's the great challenge in this country, because we have different movements throughout this country, and they are anti one another, and some are violent, some are not so violent, but at the end of the day, we have a lot of political unrest that is causing violence in this country, and we have to identify who the perpetrators that are causing or potentially are going to cause that violence are going to be before we have another mass shooting. And that's the challenge for law enforcement and government as a whole.
Finally, and to that point, Manny, we know how white supremacists and white supremacist terrorists tend to communicate. They use social media platforms like 4chan and 8chan and others. Should we be monitoring social media? Are we monitoring social media to try to preemptively stop these attacks before they begin? And does that actually work with other terror groups?
We are actively monitoring social media, except that sometimes the timeline doesn't work. Picture this: the government, NSA, etc., has this wide net, and it gathers all these key words, and they have all these algorithms for certain things, whether it's terrorism, attack, bombing, active shooter, whatever it is. And I won't get into that part of it. But then they have to filter it out. That takes time. In the time that takes, there may be an actual bombing or active shooter attempt, etc. So yes, We need to get better at this. We need to get faster at this. But ultimately, it comes down to the old adage that we've been using now for over a decade: if you see something, say something. I'm sure that these young men in both El Paso and Dayton, their parents, their colleagues, their coworkers, their schoolmates, they knew something was wrong. They knew that these people were perhaps acting out, had been radicalized, had been speaking about actively doing some sort of act of violence. Somebody should have spoken out, gone to the local authorities, let them do a proper investigation. And at the very least, we would hope that the local authorities would have taken their firearms away pending an investigation, and these massacres wouldn't have happened. So everybody is a part of this. We have to be a force multiplier for law enforcement. We have to be their eyes and ears, because they can't do it on their own. It's just overwhelming, especially in today's environment where we have over 200 million firearms legally owned in this country, and there's no reckoning as to who could do what with those firearms.
Manny Gomez is a former FBI agent who spent much of his time in the Bureau focused on the fight against terrorism. Manny, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Up next, exactly 45 years ago, the President of the United States, Richard Nixon, resigned. After the break, a historian joins us to look at how the country reacted. He's also going to compare then to now.